A veteran in a park notices a little girl giving an SOS signal with gestures. What is behind this cry for help, and what action will the veteran take to save her? Don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment on where you're watching our video from. It's important for us to know that our stories resonate around the world. The house was silent, except for the faint creak of the wind pushing against the old, weathered boards. The dim light filtering through the dusty curtains gave the space an air of neglect, with shadows clinging to every corner. This was Amber's world, a cramped and suffocating existence within the four walls of a decaying home. At 10 years old, she had already learned the weight of fear and silence, two constants in her life that loomed larger than the space around her. Amber was small for her age, her thin frame a testament to the neglect she endured day after day. Her skin, a rich and deep brown, like her late mother's, often bore the marks of her suffering, bruises on her arms, scratches on her legs, and a hunger in her eyes that had little to do with food. Her thick curls, usually left unkempt, framed her round face, where her wide eyes reflected the unspoken pain of a child forced to grow up too soon. The house was a prison not just because of its crumbling walls and stale air, but because of the man who controlled every aspect of her life. Eric, her white stepfather, loomed large in her world. His presence was as oppressive as the heat of the broken radiator that never stopped clanking in the corner. He despised her not just for her silence, her inability to speak or hear, but for the way her very existence reminded him of things he hated, things he despised. Her mother, a black woman with an unshakable kindness, had been the one light in this otherwise bleak place. But now, even that light was gone. The day her mother fell or was pushed down the creaking staircase marked the beginning of Amber's nightmare. Eric's cruelty came in many forms. He rationed food to punish her, sometimes letting her go days with nothing but scraps. He locked her in her tiny room when she displeased him, a room that was more storage closet than a sanctuary. It held a single mattress with a thin, threadbare blanket and a stuffed bear that her mother had given her, a relic of a time when love and warmth still existed in her life. The walls were bare, except for the cracks that spread like veins through the plaster, and the window was too high for her to reach even if she dared to try. Amber's only respite from this hellish existence was the park. Eric allowed her to go there once or twice a week, but only because he believed it kept the neighbors from asking too many questions. It was a calculated act, not a kindness. He would send her out with strict instructions: stay visible, don't talk to anyone, and be back on time. Of course, she couldn't talk even if she wanted to. Her world had been silent since birth, and Eric never let her forget that her deafness was just another reason for his disdain. The park was where Amber found a fragile thread of hope, the vibrant green of the grass. The towering oaks with their sprawling branches and the occasional sight of children laughing and playing, it was a glimpse of a world that felt distant and unreachable. She loved to sit on a bench near the old fountain where she could watch birds fluttering around the water and the gentle splash of their wings as they bathed. She would imagine what their songs might sound like, trying to piece together the melody she could never hear at night when she lay curled up on her thin mattress. Amber would dream of escaping in her dreams. She ran far away from this house and its shadows, from Eric and his sharp words and violent hands, she imagined. A world where her silence didn't make her invisible, where people saw her for who she was and not as a burden. These dreams were her refuge, but they always ended too soon, replaced by the cold reality of her life, one evening as the sky turned orange and purple with the fading light. Amber sat on her usual bench in the park. She clutched her stuffed bear tightly, her small hands gripping its worn fur as if it could shield her from the world across the park. She noticed an older man sitting alone on a bench near the path. His posture was heavy, his shoulders slumped, as if carrying an invisible weight. His skin, dark like hers, seemed to shimmer in the golden light, and his face was lined with age and something deeper, loss, perhaps, or regret. She watched him for a long time. Her curiosity piqued despite her fear of strangers. There was something about him that felt different. He didn't seem hurried or distracted like the other adults who passed through the park. He sat there, still and quiet, gazing at nothing in particular, as if lost in his thoughts. Amber wondered who he was and why he looked so sad that night. As she lay in bed, Amber thought about the man. She didn't know why, but something about him made her feel that maybe, just maybe, he might understand her. She clutched her bear tightly and closed her eyes, imagining what it would be like to talk to someone who would listen, even if she couldn't speak. The days passed, and Amber returned to the park, hoping to see him again. Each time her heart leapt when she spotted him sitting on the same bench. She wanted to approach him to find a way to communicate, but fear held her back. What if he was like Eric? What if he ignored her or, worse, hurt her? She had learned the hard way that trusting adults was dangerous. One day, however, something changed. As she sat on her bench, clutching her bear and watching the man from afar, he looked up and caught her gaze for a moment. Their eyes locked, and Amber felt a strange warmth in her chest, a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time. He smiled at her, a small, gentle smile that didn't feel forced or threatening. It was enough to make her believe that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she thought. The late afternoon sun painted the park in hues of amber and gold, casting long shadows across the grass. Amber sat on her usual bench near the fountain, her hands nervously twisting the tattered ear of her stuffed bear. She had been coming to the park for weeks now, hoping to gather the courage to approach the man she often saw sitting on the opposite side. Each time she saw him, her heart beat faster, torn between fear and the faint hope that he might be someone who could help her. The man, whose name she would later learn was C, was there again today. He sat with his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped together. He wore the same olive-green jacket she had noticed before, frayed at the edges and patched in places, as though it carried its own history of battles fought and lost. His face, lined with age, bore an expression of deep thought. His eyes stared at the ground, as though searching for answers he'd never find. Amber studied him from her bench, her small fingers fidgeting with the hem of her shirt. There was something about Victor that felt different from the other adults she had encountered in her short, difficult life. He didn't move with the hurried impatience of people too busy to notice a small, silent girl, nor did he carry the kind of simmering anger that she recognized so easily in Eric. Instead, he sat quietly, his stillness speaking of a weariness she couldn't quite understand but somehow felt mirrored in herself as she watched him. Victor suddenly looked up, his gaze meeting hers across the park. Amber froze, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment she wanted to look away, to retreat into the safety of her own invisibility, but then Victor smiled. It wasn't a wide grin or a forced pleasantry. It was a small, gentle smile, one that felt as though it was meant just for her. It softened the lines of his face, and in that instant, Amber felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. Trust, encouraged by the warmth in his expression. Amber clutched her bear tighter and slid off her bench. Her steps were hesitant at first, her bare feet barely making a sound on the worn path. Victor's eyes followed her movements. His brow furrowing slightly as he noticed the way she held her bee like a shield, she stopped a few feet away from him, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure he could hear it. "Hey there," Victor said softly, his voice deep and rough like gravel underfoot. He leaned back slightly, giving her space, his posture open and unthreatening. "What's your name?" Amber didn't answer. She couldn't. Instead, she looked down at the ground, her fingers tightening their grip on her bear. Victor tilted his head, noticing her reluctance. It wasn't the shyness of a typical child. It was something deeper, something carved into her by pain and fear. He tried again. "It's okay. You don't have to talk if you don't want to." When Amber finally lifted her gaze, her eyes were filled with urgency. She raised her hands slowly, her fingers forming deliberate, careful shapes in the air. Victor frowned, trying to understand. It had been decades since his military training, but something about the motion of her hands sparked a memory. SOS. The signal was unmistakable. Victor's body tensed as the realization hit him. This little girl was asking for help. He sat up straighter, his voice gentle but serious. "Are you in trouble?" he asked, keeping his tone low so as not to scare her. Amber nodded, her movements quick and decisive. "Who's hurting you?" he pressed. Amber hesitated, glancing over her shoulder toward the edge of the park. Victor followed her gaze and saw a man standing by a car, leaning against it with a cigarette dangling from his lips. The man was watching them, his expression hard and unreadable. Victor's stomach turned. The man raised his hand, motioning for Amber to come. Her small body seemed to shrink at the gesture, her shoulders hunching as if she were bracing for something. Victor clenched his jaw, anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. He had seen that kind of intimidation before in war zones and battered homes. It was a look of someone who thrived on control and fear. "Is that him?" Victor asked quietly, his voice steady. Amber nodded again, her eyes wide with fear. Victor wanted to act, to do something right then and there, but he knew better than to rush in without a plan. He had learned the hard way that impulsive decisions could put people in even greater danger. Instead, he gave Amber a small nod, trying to reassure her. "I'll help you," he said, his voice firm. "I promise." Before he could say more, the man by the car called out, his voice sharp and impatient. Amber flinched at the sound, her hands trembling as she clutched her bear tighter. Victor felt a surge of protectiveness rise within him, but he forced himself to remain calm. He couldn't afford to draw attention to himself. "Not yet." "Go on," Victor said, softly. "It's okay, I'll be here." Amber looked at him for a long moment, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. Then she turned and walked back toward the man. Her steps slowly and reluctantly. Victor watched as the man grabbed her arm and shoved her into the car, his anger evident in the way he moved. The engine roared to life and the car sped off, leaving Victor sat alone on the bench, his hands clenched into fists. For a long time he sat there, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the image of Amber's eyes, the silent plea they held. He thought of the scars he had seen on her arms, the way she had cowered under the man's gaze. It was too familiar, too reminiscent of things he had tried to leave behind. He couldn't ignore it. Victor stood and began to walk home, his steps heavy with purpose. He didn't know yet what he would do, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let that little girl face her nightmare alone. Victor couldn't get Amber out of his mind. The memory of her frail body standing before him, her small hands urgently signaling for help, was etched into his thoughts like a scar. He had tried to push it away, but it lingered, a silent reminder of the things he couldn't ignore that night as he sat in his small, cluttered apartment, surrounded by old photographs and dusty medals from a past that no longer seemed relevant. He made a decision. He picked up the phone, his hand steady, as he dialed a number he hadn't used in years. On the other end, a familiar voice answered, a gruff, cautious greeting that softened when Victor introduced himself. "Arthur, it's Victor," he said, his voice low. "I need your help." Arthur was an old friend, a fellow veteran who had once served alongside Victor in Vietnam. After returning home, Arthur had found his calling in social work, helping families caught in cycles of abuse and violence. And he had seen the worst of humanity, both on the battlefield and in the homes he visited, and he had never turned his back on someone in need. Victor knew he could count on him. They met the next day at a small diner on the edge of town. The place was mostly empty, the scent of coffee and frying bacon lingering in the air. Victor spotted Arthur in a corner. Booth, his broad shoulders hunched over a cup of coffee, looked up as Victor approached, his face breaking into a tired smile. "Damn, Victor," Arthur said, standing to give his friend a hug. "It's been too long." "Yeah, it has," Victor agreed, though his smile was strained. He couldn't shake the urgency that had been gnawing at him since the previous day. He sat down across from Arthur, his hands resting on the table, fingers tapping nervously against the chipped formica. "So what's going on?" Arthur asked, his expression growing serious as he studied Victor's face. "You wouldn't call me unless it was something big." Victor took a deep breath and then began to recount what had happened in the park. He told Arthur about the little girl, about her signals for help, and about the man who had dragged her away. Arthur listened intently, his brow furrowing, the lines on his face deepening as Victor spoke. When Victor finished, Arthur was silent for a moment, his gaze distant. He rubbed his chin thoughtfully, then looked back at Victor. "You're sure she was signaling for help?" "Positive," Victor said, his voice firm. "It was an SOS, and the way that guy looked at her, Arthur, I've seen that look before. He was controlling her, scaring her." Arthur nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing. "We need to be careful. If this guy is dangerous, we can't just go barging in. We need proof, something we can take to the authorities." "I know," Victor said, frustration edging into his voice. "But she needs help now. I can't just sit around and do nothing." Arthur reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand on Victor's arm. "We'll get her out of there," he promised, "but we have to do it the right way. If we act too soon, we could make things worse for her." Victor knew Arthur was right, but it didn't make the waiting any easier. They spent the next hour discussing their plan, sketching out the steps they would need to take. Arthur agreed to start digging into the man's background, using his connections and social services to see if there were any prior complaints or suspicions. Meanwhile, Victor would keep an eye on the park, hoping to see Amber again over the next few days. Victor returned to the park every afternoon. Sitting on the same bench where he had first seen Amber, he watched for any sign of her, his heart pounding each time. A car pulled up, or a figure appeared at the edge of the path. The days stretched on, and still she didn't come. Each night, Victor would return home, his frustration growing, the weight of helplessness settling in his chest like a stone. It was on the 5th day that he finally saw her again. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, the sky painted in shades of pink and orange. Victor was about to give up and head home when he saw her small figure appear at the edge of the park. She was alone this time, her eyes darting nervously as she made her way to the bench. Victor's breath caught in his throat, a mix of relief and anxiety flooding through him. He waited until she was seated before he approached, moving slowly so as not to startle her. Amber looked up as he drew near, her eyes widening in recognition. Victor smiled gently, sitting down beside her, keeping a respectful distance. "Hey, Amber," he said softly. Though he knew she couldn't hear him, he raised his hands, attempting to mimic the gestures she had shown him before. It was clumsy, and he knew he wasn't getting it quite right, but Amber seemed to understand. She watched him. Her eyes softening slightly, she looked around, as if checking to make sure they were alone, then turned back to Victor. Slowly she began to move her hands, her fingers forming words in the air. Victor watched carefully, his eyes focused on her hands, trying to decipher the message. He recognized some of the signs, bad, danger, help, and the fear in her eyes filled in the rest. Victor nodded, his expression serious. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small notebook and a pen. He handed them to Amber, gesturing for her to write. She hesitated for a moment, then took the notebook, her hand shaking slightly as she began to scribble. Victor watched as the words took shape on the page, his stomach twisting at what he saw. "He keeps guns in the basement. He hits me if I talk. Please help." Victor clenched his jaw, anger boiling beneath the surface. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He couldn't afford to lose control. Not now, not when Amber was depending on him. He nodded, taking the notebook back and writing a message for her. "I will help you, I promise. Stay strong. I need a little more time to make sure you're safe." Amber read the words, her eyes filling with tears. She looked up at Victor, her lips trembling as she mouthed a silent thank you. Victor felt his chest tighten, a mix of sorrow and determination washing over him. He reached out gently, patting her shoulder, offering what little comfort he could. Suddenly, Amber's head snapped up, her eyes widening in panic. Victor followed her gaze and saw a man approaching, a tall, broad figure with a scowl etched across his face. It was Eric. He moved toward them with long, angry strides, his eyes locked on Amber, fury written in every line of his body. Victor's heart pounded as he quickly stood, positioning himself between Eric and Amber. He could feel the tension radiating off the man, the barely contained rage that simmered beneath the surface. "What the hell are you doing?" Eric snarled, his voice low and menacing. He grabbed Amber's arm, yanking her away from Victor. She winced, her eyes wide with fear. Victor forced himself to stay calm, his hands clenching at his sides. "She was just sitting here, minding her own business," he said evenly, his voice steady. "You don't need to be rough with her," Eric glared at Victor, his lips curling into a sneer. "Your damn business, old man," he spat, pulling Amber closer. "She's my kid, and I'll deal with her how I see fit." Victor felt his blood boil, but he knew better than to escalate the situation. He watched helplessly as Eric dragged Amber away, her eyes meeting Victor's for one brief heartbreaking moment before she was forced into the car. The door slammed shut, and within seconds they were gone, leaving Victor standing alone, his heart heavy with frustration and fear. He knew now more than ever that he couldn't wait much longer. Amber was in immediate danger, and he had to act before it was too late. He pulled out his phone, his hand shaking slightly as he dialed Arthur's number. "Arthur, it's Victor," he said, his voice tense. "I just saw her again. She needs out now." There was a pause on the other end, then Arthur's voice was calm and determined. "All right, we're moving up the timeline. I've got some information on the guy. Meet me tomorrow and we'll figure this out." Victor hung up. His mind racing, he looked around the now empty park, the sky darkening as the sun dipped below the horizon. He felt a sense of urgency like never before, his heart pounding with the weight of what lay ahead. He had promised Amber that he would help her, and he intended to keep that promise no matter what it took. The night was dark and quiet, the air heavy with tension as Victor sat in his small apartment, the dim light of a single lamp casting shadows on the walls. His mind was racing, replaying the image of Eric dragging Amber away, her eyes wide with fear and desperation. He had to act, and he had to act soon. The stakes were higher than he had imagined, and the clock was ticking. The next morning, Victor met Arthur in the same diner where they had first discussed their plan. This time there was no warmth in their greeting, only determination. Arthur looked at Victor with grim seriousness, sliding a folder across the table. Victor opened it. His eyes scanned the pages filled with notes and photographs. "That's Eric," Arthur said, nodding toward a grainy black and white photo of the man who had taken Zorro's real name, Eric Hugo. "He's got a record of assault, possession of illegal firearms, and some connections to local gangs. Nothing concrete enough to put him away for good, but enough to know he's dangerous." Victor's jaw tightened as he studied the photo. It was Eric, all right. His cold eyes stared out from the page, the same eyes that had looked at Amber with such disdain. He could feel the anger bubbling beneath the surface, but he forced himself to focus on what mattered. They had to get Amber out of that house. Arthur continued, "I've got some contacts in the department willing to help, but they need more than just a hunch. They need something solid, evidence that he's endangering her. Otherwise, it's our word against his, and that won't be enough." Carr nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "What do we need?" he asked. Arthur leaned back, folding his arms across his chest. "We need proof that he's got those guns in the house. We also need something that shows he's abusing her. Marks, bruises, anything. If we can get that, we can bring in child services and the police, but until then?" She's stuck. Victor finished, his voice tight with frustration. Arthur looked at him, his eyes filled with sympathy. "I know it's hard, but we can't afford to mess this up. If we act too soon, we could lose our chance to help her." Victor took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He knew Arthur was right, but every instinct in his body screamed at him to do something, anything, to get Amber out of that house. He thought of her small hands, her fingers trembling as she signed for help. He couldn't let her down. They spent the next few hours going over their plan in detail. Arthur would use his contact to keep an eye on Eric's movements, while Victor would do whatever he could to get more information. It was risky, but they were running out of options. That evening, Victor returned to the park, hoping for another chance to see Amber. He knew it was unlikely. Eric had been furious the last time, and it was doubtful he'd let her out of his sight anytime soon, but Victor couldn't just sit at home and do nothing. He waited for hours, the sun sinking lower and lower until the park was bathed in twilight. Just as he was about to give up, he saw a small figure at the edge of the park. His heart leapt into his throat as he recognized Amber, her body moving cautiously, her eyes darting around as if she was afraid of being seen. Victor stood, moving toward her slowly, trying not to startle her. She saw him, and her face brightened, a flicker of hope crossing her features. She hurried over, her stuffed bear clutched tightly to her chest. "Hey, Amber," Victor said softly, crouching down to her level. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the small notebook and pen he had brought with him. He handed them to her, watching as she began to write, her movements quickly and urgently. "He's watching me all the time. He knows I met you. He said he'll hurt me if I talk to you again." Victor clenched his teeth, his anger simmering beneath the surface. He took the notebook, writing back carefully. "We're going to help you. You have to be strong a little longer. Do you know if he's keeping the guns in the house?" Amber nodded, her eyes wide. She took the pen, drawing a rough sketch of the house, marking an X where the basement was. Victor studied it, his mind racing. They had what they needed. They just had to get in and get proof. Suddenly, Amber stiffened, her eyes widening in fear. Victor turned, following her gaze, and his stomach dropped. Eric was standing at the edge of the park, his face twisted in anger, his fists clenched at his sides. "Amber," he shouted, his voice echoing through the quiet park. "Get over here now!" Amber's whole body seemed to shrink, her shoulders hunching as she took a step back. Victor could see the terror in her eyes, and it broke something inside him. He couldn't let her go back, not like this. "Stay calm," Victor whispered, his voice steady. He stood, placing himself between Amber and Eric. He could feel the tension radiating off the man as he approached, his eyes narrowing. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Eric snarled, his voice low and dangerous. He grabbed Amber's arm, jerking her toward him. Victor saw her wince, her face contorted in pain. "Let her go," Victor said, his voice calm but firm. He kept his hands at his sides, trying to project an air of authority without escalating the situation. "You don't need to be rough with her," Eric sneered, his lips curling in disdain. "This is my kid," he spat. "You have no right to tell me how to handle her." Victor clenched his jaw, his heart pounding. He wanted nothing more than to rip away from this man, to shield her from his anger, and take her far, far away. But he knew that if he made to move now, it would only make things worse for her. He had to be smart and had to think ahead. "I'm just looking out for her," Victor said, his voice level. "You don't want trouble, and neither do I. Just take it easy." Eric glared at him. His eyes narrowing, he pulled Amber closer, his grip tight on her arm. "You stay the hell away from us," he growled. "Next time I see you near her, you'll regret it." With that, he turned, dragging Amber with him. Victor watched, his heart heavy as they walked away, the tension in Eric's body evident with every step. Amber glanced back at him. Her eyes filled with a silent plea. It was all Victor could do to stay where he was. His fist clenched at his sides, his body trembling with the effort to hold himself back as soon as they were out of sight. Victor let out a long breath. His chest was tight with frustration and fear. He pulled out his phone, dialing Arthur's number with shaking hands. "Arthur." "It's Victor," he said. As soon as his friend picked up, "I just saw her again. He's getting worse. We need to move now." There was a pause on the other end, then Arthur's voice, calm but urgent. "All right, I'll make some calls. We're moving up the timeline. We've got to get her out of there." Victor hung up, his heart pounding. He looked around the empty park, the darkness closing in as the sun finally dipped below the horizon. The world felt too quiet, too still, as if holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. He couldn't let Amber down. He wouldn't. He had made a promise to her, and he intended to keep it, no matter what it took that night. Victor lay awake in his small apartment staring at the ceiling, the shadows shifting above him. He thought of Amber, of her small frame trembling under Eric's grasp, and he felt a surge of determination. He had spent too long running from his past, too long hiding from the things he couldn't change. But this was something he could do. He could make a difference for Amber. And he would ring. He reached over to his nightstick, grabbing the notebook she had used. He flipped it open to the page where she had drawn the layout of the house, his eyes tracing the lines of her shaky drawing. The basement, that was. Where Eric kept the guns. If they could get in there and get proof they could save her. The plan began to take shape in his mind, each step clear and deliberate. It was risky, but he had faced worse odds before. He had nothing to lose. But Amber, she had everything to gain. He would do whatever it took to make sure she was safe. The next day, Victor and Arthur met again, this time at Arthur's small office in the social services building. The air was tense as they went over their plan, each detail more crucial than the last. Arthur had managed to pull some strings, arranging for a welfare check on Eric's house. It wasn't much, but it was a start. "We're going to need evidence," Arthur said, his eyes serious as he looked at Victor. "The welfare check will give us away, but if we don't find anything, they won't be able to do much. We need to make sure we have something they can use." Victor nodded, his jaw set. "I'll get it," he said, "whatever it takes." The plan was set. Arthur would be there with the authorities, using his position to make sure they didn't overlook anything. Victor, meanwhile, would do what he could to make sure they had what they needed. Proof of the guns, of the abuse, it was dangerous, but it was their only shot. As Victor left the office that day, the weight of what lay ahead settled on his shoulders. He knew the risks, knew that if they failed, Amber would be the one to suffer the consequences. But he also knew that he couldn't sit back and do nothing, not when there was a chance, no matter how slim, that he could help her. That night, Victor stood outside Eric's house, his heart pounding as he watched the windows, the lights flickering inside. He knew he couldn't afford to be seen, but he had to be. There had to make sure that when the time came, he was ready. He took a deep breath, the cold night air filling his lungs, and steeled himself for what was to come. This was it. Their only chance to save Amber. And he wouldn't let her down. Not now, not ever. The darkness enveloped Victor as he crouched behind a line of bushes. His eyes trained on the dilapidated house in front of him. It was late, far past midnight, and the street was eerily silent. The only sound was the distant hum of traffic, and the occasional bark of a dog adding to the tension that hung thick in the air. Victor knew this was their moment. Everything they had planned led to this night. There was no room for error. Arthur had arranged for a welfare check, convincing the authorities that there was enough concern to warrant an inspection. Victor's job was to be ready when the time came to do whatever he needed to ensure that Amber would be free of Eric once and for all. He glanced at the watch on his wrist. The minute hand was inching closer to their agreed time. It wouldn't be long now. The plan was simple, but the risks were high. Arthur would arrive with 2 officers, using the pretense of an anonymous tip to get access to the house. Victor's role was unofficial. He wasn't supposed to be there, but he knew he needed to be on hand to make sure they had the proof they needed. He took a deep breath, willing his racing heart to slow down. He couldn't afford to let nerves get the better of him now. The lights in the house were still on, a dim glow spilling through the drawn curtains. Victor could make out a shadow moving inside Eric, no doubt pacing in the living room, likely with a drink in hand. He thought of Amber somewhere in that house, trapped and terrified, and felt a fresh surge of determination. Finally, Victor heard the sound of a car engine approaching, its headlights off as it came to a stop down the block. Arthur stepped out, his familiar silhouette moving with purpose toward the house, flanked by 2 uniformed officers. Victor watched from his hiding spot, every muscle in his body tense, as he saw Arthur knock on the door. A long moment passed before the door opened, and Victor could just barely make out Eric's shape in the doorway. There was an exchange of words. Victor couldn't hear them, but he could tell from Eric's body language that he was agitated. He stepped forward, his movements aggressive, but Arthur remained calm, gesturing toward the officers as if to reassure him. Victor held his breath, waiting for the moment when they would be allowed in, after what felt like an eternity. Eric stepped aside, and the officers entered the house, followed by Arthur. Victor let out a slow breath, his heart pounding as he watched the door close behind them. Now came the hard part, finding what they needed to make sure Amber was taken out of that place. Victor moved closer, staying low, making his way around the side of the house. He knew where the basement was. Amber had shown him the layout in her notebook. He crept along the side wall, careful to stay in the shadow until he reached the narrow window that looked down. Into the basement, he peered through the dirty glass, his eyes straining to see. In the dim light there, in the corner, he saw it. A stack of crates, the tops open to reveal the unmistakable shape of firearms. Victor's breath caught in his throat. This was it, the proof they needed. He pulled out his phone, quickly snapping a few photos through the window, making sure to get a clear view of the guns. He knew Arthur would need these to back up their story. Suddenly, the back door slammed open behind them, and Victor heard Eric's voice, raw with rage. "Hey, where do you think you're going?" Victor turned his eyes, meeting Eric's across the yard. He could see the fury in Eric's face, the way his eyes burned with anger, and Victor knew they had to run. "Go," he whispered to Amber, pushing her ahead of him. She hesitated for just a moment, then turned and ran, her small feet pounding across the grass. Victor followed, his eyes darting around, looking for anything he could use to slow Eric down. He spotted an old garden hose coiled near the side of the house and grabbed it, tossing it behind him as he ran, hoping it would at least buy them a few seconds. He could hear Eric's heavy footsteps behind him. The man's voice grew louder as he cursed and stumbled over the hose. They reached the alley, and Victor saw Arthur standing by the car, his eyes widening in surprise as he saw them get her in the car. Victor shouted, his voice hoarse with urgency. Arthur didn't hesitate. He opened the back door, reaching out to grab Amber and pull her inside. Victor could hear the pounding of Eric's footsteps growing closer, and he turned, ready to face him if he had to. But then the officers appeared, bursting out of the back door, their guns drawn. "Eric, Hugo, stop right there," one of them shouted, his voice ringing out across the yard. Eric skidded to a halt, his eyes wide with surprise and fury. He looked from Victor to the officers, his face contorted with rage. "This isn't over," Eric shouted, his voice raw and filled with venom. He took a step back, his hands raised as the officers moved toward him, their guns still trained on his chest. Victor didn't wait to see what would happen next. He turned and ran to the car, climbing into the passenger seat. As Arthur started the engine, he looked back at Amber. Her eyes were wide and filled with tears, and he reached out gently, squeezing her shoulder. "You're safe now," he said, his voice soft. "We're going to get you out of here." Arthur drove away in the car, speeding down the dark alley, the house growing smaller and smaller in the rearview mirror. Victor watched as it disappeared from sight, his chest tightening with a mix of relief and lingering fear. It wasn't over. Not yet. But they had taken the first step. He looked back at Amber, her small frame huddled in the back seat, her stuffed bear clutched tightly to her chest. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope, and Victor felt a surge of determination. They had gotten her out, but now they had to make sure she would never have to go back. Arthur glanced over at Victor, his eyes serious. "We did it," he said, his voice low. "But we have a long road ahead." Victor nodded, his eyes still on Amber. "We'll take it one step at a time," he said. He knew there were challenges ahead: court hearings, social services, the possibility that Eric might try to fight for custody. But he also knew that Amber wasn't alone anymore. She had people who cared about her, people who would fight for her. As they drove away from the house, the night was still dark around them. Victor felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. He looked at Amber, her eyes beginning to close as exhaustion took over, and he knew that for her this was just the beginning, and he would be there every step of the way to make sure she got the future she deserved. The sky was beginning to lighten, the first pale fingers of dawn stretching across the horizon as Victor watched the city. Rolled by from the passenger seat, the events of the past night played over and over in his mind like scenes from a film he couldn't pause or stop. He turned back to look at Amber, curled up in the back seat, her head resting against the window, her eyes closed. She had finally fallen asleep, exhaustion overtaking her small body after what felt like a lifetime of fear and uncertainty. Victor exchanged a glance with Arthur, who kept his eyes on the road, the tension of the night still etched on his face. They had done it. They had gotten her out, but Victor knew that their work was far from over. The night had been just the beginning of a long journey toward a new life for Amber, and he had promised himself that he would see her through every step. They pulled into a quiet driveway. The modest house was bathed in the soft early morning light. It belonged to a couple who had agreed to take Amber in temporarily, a family that Arthur knew from his work, a couple who had opened their home to children in need many times before. Arthur turned off the engine, and the sudden silence was thick, filled with the weight of everything that had happened. Victor turned to Amber, reaching back to gently touch her shoulder. "Amber," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, confusion clouded her gaze until she saw Victor's face. He smiled at her, trying to reassure her that they were safe now. "We're here," he said, and though she couldn't hear his words, she seemed to understand. She nodded slowly, rubbing her eyes and hugging her stuffed bear closer as she sat up. Victor opened the car door and stepped out, moving to help Amber out of the back seat. The door to the house opened and a woman stepped out, a kind-looking lady in her 50s with soft gray hair and a gentle smile. Her name was Lucy. She approached slowly, not wanting to startle Amber, and knelt down to her level, her smile warm and welcoming. "Hi, sweetheart," Lucy said, her voice gentle as she looked at Amber. She signed as she spoke, her hands moving with a practiced ease that immediately put Amber at ease. "My name is Lucy. You're safe here, and we're so happy to have you." Amber looked up at her, her wide eyes filled with uncertainty, but there was something in Lucy's gaze, a warmth that reminded her of her mother. Amber nodded, glancing back at Victor, her eyes questioning. Victor smiled at her, nodding. "It's okay, Amber," he said. Even though she couldn't hear him, he signed the words as best as he could, his movements clumsy but sincere. "You're safe here, I promise." Amber looked back at Lucy and then slowly reached out, taking her hand. Lucy smiled gently, pulling Amber into a hug. Amber hesitated for a moment, then slowly relaxed, allowing herself to lean into the woman's embrace. It had been so long since she had felt a touch that was gentle, a hug that was filled with care and love. She closed her eyes, a single tear escaping as she let herself feel the safety she hadn't known, and what felt like forever. Lucy led Amber inside with her arm around her shoulders, while Arthur stayed by the car watching. Victor stood there for a moment, watching them disappear into the house, a lump forming in his throat. He knew this was what Amber needed, a place where she could feel safe, a place where she could begin to heal, but it still tore at his heart to let her go, even just for a little while. Arthur came up beside him, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "You did good," Victor said. His voice was gruff but filled with warmth. "She's in good hands now." Victor nodded, his eyes still on the door. "I know," he said, his voice tight. He took a deep breath, then turned to Arthur, his eyes filled with determination. "But I'm not walking away, not from her. She's got a long road ahead, and I'm going to be here for her, whatever it takes." Arthur smiled, nodding. "I didn't think you would. She needs you, Victor. You're the one she trusts." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, hearings, and visits. Victor found himself spending more time in courtrooms and social services offices than he had ever imagined, fighting to ensure that Eric would never be able to hurt Amber again. Each day brought its own set of challenges, and there were times when Victor felt like the system was stacked against them. too slow and too indifferent to the urgency of Amber's situation, but he refused to give up. Lucy kept him updated on Amber's progress. She told him how Amber had been quiet at first, withdrawn and wary, but little by little she was starting to open up. She was eating more, gaining strength, and she had even started to smile again. A small, tentative smile that gave Victor hope every time he heard about it. And she had started to sign more, communicating with Lucy and her husband, showing them glimpses of the bright, intelligent girl she was beneath all the fear and pain. Victor visited as often as he could, each visit a bright spot in the otherwise grueling fight to ensure Amber's safety. The first time he came to see her, she ran to him, throwing her arms around his waist, holding him tight as if afraid he might disappear. Victor knelt down, hugging her back, his eyes stinging with unshed tears. He hadn't realized just how much he had come to care for this little girl until that moment, the weight of her trust and affection nearly overwhelming him. "Hey, kiddo," he said, pulling back slightly to look at her. He signed the words slowly, making sure she understood. "Are you doing okay?" Amber nodded, her eyes shining. She took his hand, leading him inside, eager to show him the drawings she had been working on. Lucy had given her a set of colored pencils, and Amber had taken to drawing the world around her, the trees in the yard, the flowers in the garden, and even a picture of Victor, his familiar old jacket carefully colored in green. Victor spent hours with her that day, watching her draw, helping her with her homework, and listening as she signed stories about the little things she was discovering in her new home for the first time. Amber seemed like a child, free to laugh, to explore, to be curious. It filled Victor's heart with a sense of purpose, a feeling he hadn't known in years. The day of the final court hearing came, and Victor found himself sitting in the sterile, impersonal courtroom, his hands clenched together in his lap. Eric was there, his expression cold and defiant as he listened to the charges against him. Victor watched as the judge listened to the evidence. Amber's testimony, the photos of the guns, and the statements from Arthur and the officers. Each word felt like a step toward justice, a step toward ensuring that Amber would never have to face that man again when the judge finally ruled in favor of terminating Eric's parental rights. Victor let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. It was over. Amber was free that evening. Victor returned to Lucy's house, wanting to share the news with Amber. He knocked on the door, his heart pounding with a mix of excitement and relief. Lucy opened the door, her face breaking into a smile when she saw him. "She's in the backyard," Lucy said, stepping aside to let him in. "She's been waiting for you." Victor made his way through the house, stepping out into the backyard. Amber was sitting on the grass, her colored pencils scattered around her, her head bent over her drawing. When she looked up and saw Victor, her face lit up and she scrambled to her feet, running toward him. Victor knelt down, catching her in his arms, holding her tight. "It's over, kiddo," he whispered, signing the words slowly. "You're safe now. He can't hurt you anymore." Amber pulled back slightly, her eyes searching his face. She signed a single word: "Promise." Victor nodded, his eyes filled with emotion. "Promise," he signed back. Amber smiled then, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes, and Victor felt his heart swell with pride and love. He knew there were still challenges ahead. Healing took time, and Amber had been through more than any child should ever have to endure. But he also knew that she was strong, stronger than anyone he had ever known, and he would be there for her every step of the way. He stood, taking her hand, and they walked back toward the house together, the sun setting behind them, casting a warm golden glow over the yard. It felt like the beginning of something new. A new life for Amber, one filled with love, safety, and hope. And for Victor, it was a new beginning too. He had spent so many years lost in his own grief, weighed down by the past, but now he had found a purpose again. He had found someone who needed him, someone who had given him a reason to keep going. As he looked down at Amber, her small hand in his, he knew that he had finally found his way home. Thank you for being with us until the end of this story. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss more exciting and emotional stories. We create these stories to share them with you, and your support is very important to us. Don't forget to give us a like and leave a comment. Your opinion helps us get better. Share this video with your friends and family so more people can experience our stories. And also, if you want to continue diving into the fascinating world, check out our playlist to see the other stories we have in store for you. See you soon, and may each story bring you something important and inspiring.